Hello and welcome to Travels Through Time, the podcast made in partnership with Unseen Histories. Hi, it's Violet here. This week we are braving the thrills and terrors of the Ottoman court under its greatest sultan. There was no shortage of extraordinary rulers in the 16th century. Ivan the Terrible towered over Russia. England had its own Gloriana, Elizabeth I. Charles V governed the vast Holy Roman Empire, while in India, the Emperor Akbar transformed Mughal culture. But every one of these mighty potentates cowered in the shadow of the man who ruled the Ottoman Empire between 1520 and 1566. Suleyman the Magnificent, Lord of Lords, master of the celestial conjunction and territories that stretched from Baghdad to Bulgaria. Feared and admired in equal measure, Suleyman was the sultan who got closest to the golden apple, the fabled pot of gold at the end of the Islamic rainbow, representing unlimited wealth and power, and ultimately the defeat of Christian forces and the domination of the heart of Europe. He conquered the island of Rhodes and much of Hungary, only facing defeat at the gates of Vienna in 1529. In his compelling new book, The Lion House, the award-winning writer and expert on the Islamic world, Christopher de Bellaigue, takes us deep inside the Ottoman corridors of power in this dramatic period of their history. Christopher took me on this travel through time the other day. Welcome to Travels Through Time, Christopher de Bellaigue.
Thank you very much.
So today we're going to be talking about your new book, The Lion House, The Coming of a King, which is all about Suleyman the Magnificent, who was the most powerful ruler in the 16th century and definitely the most exciting. But before we talk about him specifically, I wanted to ask you about your relationship with the Islamic world, because you've written several award-winning books about various different aspects of it, and you've also worked for many years as a journalist, and I know you've lived there for long periods of time. So can you just tell us a bit about your relationship with the Islamic world?
Well, as you say, I started as a journalist, so I went where the work was. Quite by chance, I ended up pretty early on moving from India, where I started, to Turkey and becoming the economist correspondent there in my 20s. And it was a tremendously exciting time to be in Turkey. Turkey was not very well known. And there was quite a lot going on. And so my interest in the Islamic world was filtered through Turkey and the Turkish present. And I was concerned with the contemporary and what was happening there and then. And gradually over time, my interest grew deeper, and I started to delve into the Turkish past. Then I moved to Iran, and I became the economist correspondent in Iran. And I also married an Iranian lady. And that kind of formalized my relationship with the Islamic world. And then came the so-called war on terror. And being in Iran, which was a kind of haven of stability amid a rather turbulent sea, I was able to kind of branch out and do a lot of reporting from Afghanistan and Iraq and other places during this very interesting, tragic and turbulent time. I think it's kind of pretty self-evident that if you spend enough time doing the present, you start to think about the context. And to my mind, history is context. It's about explaining the context for what we know is happening or think is happening now. And so I started to write books that delved into the past. I did an oral history in Eastern Turkey, which was about the Kurds and the Armenians and the Turks contesting the same very small parcel of land. That was quite a difficult book to write because I was inserting myself into people's lives. people who didn't necessarily want me to for me to be inserted into their lives. But that was Rebel Land. I also wrote a book about Iran after the revolution, and another book about British involvement in Iran, particularly our involvement in the coup of 1953, when British and American agents toppled a popular Iranian prime minister who had dared to nationalize the oil industry. And then my most recent book was a sort of self-consciously magisterial kind of overview called the Islamic Enlightenment, and that is essentially taking the idea that the Islamic world has been resistant to new ideas and challenging it through quite in-depth looks at the modernization process in Egypt and Turkey and Iran, and the characters and the events that shaped that modernization process over the 19th and 20th century.
And what I wanted to ask you about how it is for you writing about a part of the world that is, your adopted home, and as you say, you're married to an Iranian. How do you find that? How do you find doing the research? Are people receptive and glad that you're doing it? And then, how are your books received in that part of the world? So, can you just talk a bit about that?
I think it's difficult to generalize, because I think each book has its own identity and its own character. The book I wrote about Mohammad Mossadegh, the prime minister who was toppled in Iran in 1953, has been a massive success in Iran. It has been translated by various different people. There's no copyright there, so everyone just picks it up and translates it and brings it out. And it's been enormously successful. I would say that there's no hard and fast rule. I mean, researching Rebel Land in eastern Turkey was very difficult. Not everyone wanted me to be there. And the Turkish state certainly didn't want me being there and delving into elements of the Armenian genocide that they would prefer not to be revealed. So it's kind of depends on the book. But I write primarily. In fact, I write in English for a Western audience. So my audience is primarily in the West. And when these books are translated, then sometimes they do very well and sometimes they're just completely ignored.
Yeah. And do you think, so I suppose I want to know what your sort of aim is. What do you hope will be the result of your books? Are you hoping to contribute to mutual understanding? Because in my experience, the problems between the, so-called Western Christian world and the Islamic world that we've had in recent decades, so much of it seems to be as a result of a lack of understanding and a lack of knowledge of each other. And I just wonder what you think about that.
Yeah, I've been living back in the UK since 2007, and I haven't stopped trying to achieve something along the lines that you've just described. There's an enormous kind of ignorance and mistrust on both sides, but since I'm addressing a Western audience, I'm trying to kind of chip away at that Western ignorance, and I do that in lots of different ways. I do it in articles and reviews, and I do it in my books. My most recent article was about an extraordinary initiative to launch a series of exhibitions in France about Islamic art, and a really remarkable kind of simultaneous exhibition in 18 different galleries across France that bring different elements of Islamic civilization to the attention of people who haven't really given proper thought to that civilization and what it actually means, and whose conception of Islamic civilization is formed by an idea of an unsmiling, stern, fanatical, rather unpleasant civilization, and doesn't really make room for the playfulness and the joy and the light that also inheres within that civilization. So I've just been writing a quite a fulsome and praise-some review of that. So I do that kind of thing all the time. I think the Lionhouse is a little bit different. Suleyman the Magnificent is not well known. People have heard of him, but he hasn't been written about for a very long time. It's about time that someone looked at him afresh, and also told the story. I think the story is so wonderful that I think in this book I'm trying to tell a story.
Well, and also, I mean, what you really take from your book is how connected the all these worlds were, and all these different parts of Europe and different parts of the Islamic Empire. There were enormous connections, weren't there, back then?
The connections are, of course, extraordinary, and they've been brought out by others in the past. But what I think I tried to do in The Lionhouse, which has quite a narrow scope in terms of time, it's just about the first years of Suleyman's period of power, is to what I think perhaps comes across is the extraordinary interpenetration that existed then between people of different kinds and different origins who were all in some way made welcome by the Ottoman court and were exploited and used by the Ottoman court in order to achieve really quite global aims. And I think this is a great contrast between what could be described as the more insular approach of the Western Christian monarchies of the time. And I suppose the most glaring example of that would be the Habsburg monarchy, which was very informed by attempts to rebuff Lutheranism, attempts to standardize Catholic practice, and also heavily informed by the expulsion of the Jewish population of Iberia, and also the forced conversion and expulsion of many Muslims after the reconquest of Iberia in 1492.
Yes, and I think that's something certainly that's in my research that I've found is that the Muslim rulers were often much more tolerant and much more interested in people of other faiths than the Christians, and it's quite difficult to feel proud of coming from the part of the world that we come from when you look at those periods of history. Can you just explain also why did you call it the Lionhouse?
The Lionhouse, I was originally going to call it the Golden Apple, which is the mythical kind of pot of gold at the end of the Islamic rainbow. The golden apple being a kind of symbol of fathomless wealth, military power, and defeat of the Christians. That is the promise awaiting every Muslim invader that would try and get to the heart of Europe. But in the end, the book turned out to be much more to do with the machinations within the Ottoman court, or at least as much to do with that, and the interplay between four extraordinary characters who I deal with at great length and who I try and get to know and get the reader to know. And that Ottoman court inhabits the site of the former New Rome or Byzantium, and it's full of detritus from the Byzantine past. One relic is the Church of St. John, which is on the Hippodrome. And the Church of St. John has been converted into a kind of imperial menagerie. So every exotic beast and dangerous animal that arrives or is captured or is kept there for the Sultan's pleasure is held by a kind of caste of Moorish keepers. And they keep these animals in the lion house, as it is known. And there are indeed lions, and there are elephants, and there are lots of others. And the people of Istanbul or Constantinople, I think both words are valid and should be almost used together because of this hybrid identity. But both the people of the town are used to the screams and howls and roars and barks that come out of this lion house, and it's a place of tremendous foreboding and also exoticism. One of the characters in the book is Ibrahim Pasha, who started off a slave on the coast of Albania, was captured by pirates, sold in Ottoman Asia Minor, and was purchased by a wealthy widow who gave him a really good education. And he came into the sightline of the then Crown Prince, and they were almost exactly the same age, and they became very close friends. They had an intensely close relationship that then carried on when Suleyman became Sultan, and he brings Ibrahim along with him. And he says to the powers that be, whom he inherits from his father, the pashas and the ministers and the admirals, you've got me, but you've also got Ibrahim. And they don't like Ibrahim because he's a newcomer and he exerts some kind of strange power over their new master. And Ibrahim turns out to be one of the most remarkable statesmen and political figures of the 16th century, from that beginning on a beach in Albania where he's scooped up by pirates. And he eventually gets very powerful, very confident, and starts to think that he can boss the Sultan, his master, around. And when speaking to Habsburg diplomats, he uses the analogy of the lion and the lion keeper. And he says, the lion is, of course, immensely strong, potentially fatal, but the lion keeper has a stick and he has meat. And he can toss meat to the lion and he can use the stick to make the lion cringe. The Sultan is the lion and I am the lion keeper.
And did the Sultan hear about this analogy?
The Sultan came to hear about Ibrahim's attitude towards him. I think he also came to feel that it was time to be divested of this excessively powerful Grand Vizier. I mean, at the end, the even a matter of a kind of an administrative shuffle, the Sultan, who is Lord of Lords, who is Master of the Celestial Conjunction, whose list of titles extends from, encompasses half the world, he is unable to bring about a simple transfer of personnel without asking permission from his Grand Vizier. And there start to be a lot of whispers about Ibrahim, whether he really converted, whether he's a secret Christian, whether he has designs on the throne. And eventually in 1536, and this is the final scene of the book, so if you're interested in suspense, then don't listen to these next words. What eventually happens is that the Sultan turns against his Grand Vizier with quite nasty results.
So there's parallels with Thomas Cromwell and Henry VIII there.
There are certainly parallels that you can draw with any setup where a king or a monarch has a group of courtiers around him or her.
Yeah. Before we travel back to your chosen year, I wanted to ask you one question about the way that you write history, because it is extremely vivid and alive and in some ways almost conversational. You use the present tense a lot. It really adds to the immediacy, and I've seen it was described as eyewitness history, and I just wanted you to just elaborate a bit on that.
I came to this book with the idea of writing a conventional history. It would demonstrate various things about the Ottoman kind of diversity, but then lockdown happened and I was denied that kind of hinterland that a historian enjoys, which is to get together with other historians to bounce ideas off them. So so what lockdown did for me was it kind of denied me the opportunity to get out and about, to bounce ideas off other people, to run my eye down the shelves of libraries and bookshops and to get background and other further reading, to essentially contextualize what I was going to write about and put it in a much wider scheme. And that scheme would both be temporal. It would allow me to say, from our 21st century perspective, this seems like that, and we would say this, and then to kind of discuss the way that we look at history and to put all of these events into kind of context that is a very conventional way of writing history in the way that I've always written it. But instead, I found myself in a small room with a whole load of primary sources. And so I started to make notes from the primary sources, intending to bulk them out with all the things that I've just described and put in all this other context. But I found myself concentrating ever more intensely on the primary sources and the people that they described. And I found myself sort of transposed. I was almost undergoing some kind of transfer of attention, so that I lived much more closely their experiences, and by concentrating on the primary sources and not looking at what subsequent historians have said, not looking at the different ways that one can read history, but simply concentrating on on the events and the people I was describing, I found that to be a kind of thrilling and intense experience. I was intending to change all those notes that I'd written in the present tense to the past, but it didn't seem necessary at the end. And in fact, it seemed that the present tense was actually a good thing, because it as you say, it's the tense of immediacy. And that is the effect that I ended up wanting to put across, not the effect of a magisterial historian telling people how to think about these things or suggesting ways of thinking about these things, almost as history without the historian.
Well, I think it's wonderful. It's really a really original and brilliant way of writing history. I think now we should get in our time machine, and I'm going to ask you, which year, Christopher, would you like to travel back to today?
Well, I'm going to travel back to the Islamic year 941, which straddles the Gregorian year, or the Christian year, 1534 and 1535. This is towards the end of the period described in the Lion House. Suleyman is very much established as the Ottoman Sultan. He's had several fantastically successful military campaigns. He's taken a lot of new territory for the Ottoman Empire. In some ways, this is the climax. This year is the climax of the first kind of period of his rule. And after this, he will become a more mature and a more authoritative ruler. He's still finding his way. But this climax is expressed in 2 or 3 ways that have led to my choice of scenes. The first scene is in the autumn of 1534. And it's a scene of a well-built, very handsome, very authoritative man bent on his knees in a tent in Transylvania, outside a walled city called Mediesh. And the man is bent on his knees, pleading for his life. And outside the tent are an army shouting for his death, saying, "Kill the Turk, kill the Turk." And he can hardly hear himself think, let alone speak. And he's trying to threaten and cajole the Transylvanian leader in whose hands he has fallen, saying, "I'm a representative of the Sultan. The Sultan, you will incur the Sultan's displeasure if you kill me. I can give you lots of money, bribery, threats, everything to try and save his life." Now, this man is also, he's covered in dust. He's emaciated. He's suffering from a form of malaria called quartan fever, which comes in waves of 4 days. He's suffered a siege of about 8 weeks at this town, Mediesh, and he's run out of powder. His men, many of them have deserted him, and he's fallen into the hands of the Transylvanians. Now, who is this man, and why is he so important? His name is Alvisagriti. He's a Venetian, and he is the son of the Venetian Doge. He is also the number 3 man in the Ottoman Empire, the richest private citizen in the Ottoman Empire, a supplier of gems to the Sultan, a supplier of saltpeter to the Venetians, a supplier of tin and other metals to the Ottoman war machine, grain, purebred Arab horses, Parmesan cheese, Muscatel wine, you name it. He's got a finger.
All the good things.
All the good things. Why is he not working for his dad? Well, the reason is that he was born out of wedlock, and as an illegitimate child, he is barred entry to any of the senior positions in Venice. And being an ambitious man, he decides to make his way in Constantinople, which is where he was born in any case, his father having been a merchant there. And he speaks fluent Turkish, he speaks Greek. His mother was probably a Greek concubine. He speaks very good French. He's a linguist, and that Constantinople, Istanbul at the time is a real Babel of languages. So he fits in very well there. He's starting to make his way as a merchant and to make serious money when 2 things happen in 1523. The first is that his father is elected Doge, and so he is suddenly the son of the Doge, or the Beyoğlu. And for anyone who knows Istanbul, you might be familiar with a part of Pera, the European quarter, called Beyoğlu, and that means the son of the Lord, and it is named after Alvisagriti because that is where his palace was. So he lives on, the son of the Lord lives on. The second thing that happens in 1523 is that Ibrahim Pasha, who we talked about earlier, becomes Grand Vizier, and Ibrahim Pasha is himself isolated at the top of the political system, with only his friend the Sultan protecting him from all these hostile forces, the other pashas, and he needs an ally. And Alvise Agriti is the ideal ally. He's rich, he's a Christian, so he can never aspire to take his place, and he's fantastically well connected because he has a direct line to the Doge, and through all of those connections he has a direct line to all the princes and potentates of Europe. Alvise is, like Ibrahim, animated by power and wealth. In a way, he goes even further than Ibrahim. He becomes not only the richest private citizen in the Ottoman Empire, but also aspires to control diplomacy. And so any deal that's done, any campaign that's launched, any negotiation that takes place, all happens through Alvise Agriti. And if you're arriving in Istanbul and you want to strike some kind of deal with the Sultan, the first person you go and see is Alvise Agriti. So he uses that leverage that he has in all sorts of ways. That isn't enough for him. He wants real power. And the way he gets real power is after the Ottoman invasion of Hungary. The Ottomans invade Hungary. They put in a client called János Zápolya, but Zápolya needs someone to hold his hand. And that's Alvise Agriti, who becomes the kind of effective viceroy of the Sultan in Hungary. And he's all things to all men. To the Christians, he says, I'm fighting for Christianity and Christendom by keeping a Christian king in Hungary and not letting the Sultan formally annex the country. And to the Sultan and the Ottoman apparatus, he says, I'm working for you. I'm a devoted slave of the Sultan. He's basically operating in that extraordinarily ambiguous and liminal land between different identities, different jurisdictions, different loyalties, to the extent that no one really knows who he is loyal to if it is not himself. Things go a little awry for Alvise Agriti. He develops a lot of enemies in the Ottoman court, notably a pirate called Barbarossa, who is brought in and hates the Venetians and doesn't see why the Ottomans should have close relations with the Venetians anyway. And also he's a victim of his own hubris and his own success. And so as things become more hostile, Alvise decides that he's going to turn his coat and he's going to go over to the Habsburgs. And so when he leaves Istanbul with his army and a massive treasure worth 1.25 million ducats in 1534, it is essentially never to return. He's going to go up to Transylvania, and then he's going to ingratiate himself with the Habsburgs, and he's going to try and get just as much power as he's ever had, if not more, but using the patronage of Ferdinand of the Habsburgs, the younger brother of Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor. Unfortunately, he's made a lot of enemies in Transylvania and the whole of Hungary during his time as viceroy there. And his arrival in Transylvania and certain actions that he carries out, repressive, despotic, cruel actions that he carries out, means that there's a massive rebellion against him. And this leads to the siege at Mediaș, and gradually his force of Gritiani, who are really united only by their love of lucre and their love of wealth that they think they will get through him, melt away. He's left with a certain amount of his treasure. The people around all know that Gritti is stuck in this citadel. He's got a treasure, and also he has these extraordinary purple stockings whose pockets appear to be full, suggesting that they contain rather more than his legs. So the whole region essentially converges on Mediaș, trying to get a bit of the action and trying to kill Gritti, and eventually he ends up in this tent. It's clear that it's the end of the road for Gritti, but who's going to actually do the deed? He is still formally, at least, the representative of the Sultan. And so there's a carter there, a sly man, who comes forward and he says to the Transylvanian leader, if you give me Gritti's stockings, then I'll do the deed. And so he cuts off Alvise's head with a sword, and he takes the stockings, and indeed they contain gems of a fathomless value. And so that's the end of Alvise Gritti. And the lesson for the Sultan is, don't give a Christian so much power, because ultimately you don't know where their loyalties lie. From then on, he will only accept converted Christians into positions of immense power in the apparatus. And so that's the rather bloody end of Alvisagriti.
And did his death leave a void, which was then filled by somebody else?
Essentially what happens in 1535, 1536 is that Suleyman, whether he knows it or not, is consolidating his power, and he's getting rid of people, or allowing to be got rid, people who are detracting from his power and authority. And Alvisagriti was one person. He went around the same place saying, I'm the Sultan's representative, and then he did things that the Sultan didn't approve of. He had all these relationships with Christian powers that the Sultan was very uneasy about. It's about cutting away all those challenges to his own authority. So Alvisagriti would never be replaced, and that was exactly how the Sultan ended up wanting it. And in the second part of the Sultan's reign, which I will go on to discuss in part 2 of this trilogy, we will find that the Sultan has a much surer grip on power, precisely because he doesn't allow people like Alvisagriti to rise and to gain so much influence and authority.
Yeah, how interesting. Well, I think we should move on now to your second scene. Can you tell us where we're going, what's happening?
So the second scene is we're in Baghdad. Sultan Suleyman is asleep in an appropriated palace. The Ottoman forces have just taken Baghdad, and he is sleeping a well-deserved sleep because the campaign to take Baghdad has been such a complete dog's dinner. It's been an appalling campaign, marked by rancor, misjudgment, massacres on the wrong side. Only with great difficulty have they actually managed to take Baghdad. The aim of the campaign is, and this is always the case with the Ottomans, is that you have to be looking in all directions at all times. You see that nowadays with modern Turkey. You see that modern Turkey has to have strategies in relation to all points of the compass. And this is certainly the case in the Ottoman time. So you have big interests in Hungary, big interests in Italy, North Africa, the entire axis where they meet the Habsburgs and where there's constant fighting and negotiating. At the same time, you've got to keep an eye on your back door. And there are massive Ottoman interests down into Syria, ownership of the Holy Land, ownership of Islam's holiest places in Mecca and Medina. But the big threat is Iran. And why is Iran a threat? Iran is a threat not only because it's a different cultural entity, it's a different political entity, but also it's a different religious identity. And the religious identity of Iran is solidifying as a Shia identity, just as the Ottoman identity is solidifying as a Sunni identity. And this is an extraordinary parallel between the bifurcation of Christianity, between the Reformed or Lutheran or Protestant side of the religion and the Catholic side. And a lot of quite similar dynamics are at work in the Islamic world. Essentially what is happening is that the Iranians kind of make incursions through their proxies into Eastern Anatolia, which the Ottoman Sultan properly regards as his own territory. They send missionaries in to try and get people to adopt Shia practices. They try to get hold of resources, and so the Sultan loses patience and he has to launch a campaign against them. His leader, his general, is Ibrahim Pasha, and Ibrahim Pasha goes ahead, and eventually the Sultan joins in with his army, and they enter. They're in northwestern Iran. They've taken Tabriz, which is the Iranian capital at the time, but winter's closing in, and the Iranian king, the Shah, they still haven't faced him in battle. So they go off in pursuit of the Shah and his regime. There's half an idea that they might even invade Iran and try and stay in Iran and convert them properly to Sunnism. But the Iranians are very clever. They don't have anything like the Ottoman manpower. They don't have the technological prowess that the Ottomans have. But what they do have is winter. And so what they do is they melt away into the background as the weather gets colder, and the Ottoman advance gets as far as Sultaniye, which is further east from Tabriz. And in the shadow of an extraordinary Ilkhanid dome there, a dome that was built by the Mongol rulers at around the same time as Brunelleschi's dome in Florence and is as large and as impressive. In the shadow of that dome, the snow falls, and it doesn't stop falling. And by the time the storm has abated, several thousand Iranian troops have died of exposure and of cold, and the only thing to do is to get out of Iran and head for Baghdad. That's easier said than done. You've got to cross the Zagros Mountains in winter, but that is what Suleyman and Ibrahim decide the army needs to do. And as they do, they are harried by the fleet-footed Iranian ponies, and there's a constant fear of attack, and stragglers are picked off, and there are desertions and mini-mutinies. And by the time the Zagros Mountains have been cleared, it's clear that this is a major public relations disaster. Not only have a lot of soldiers, Ottoman soldiers, died, they've been humiliated by Iran's far less impressive military capabilities. News has got to Europe. They love the idea of the Ottoman Sultan being humbled by the fleet-footed Iranian cavalry, and someone's got to be blamed. Well, Ibrahim doesn't want to be blamed. So Ibrahim talks to the Sultan, and he comes up with a scapegoat. And this scapegoat is a man called Iskender Çelebi, who is the treasurer and also the quartermaster. So he knows all about the money, and he knows about supplying the troops. And although a lot of the decisions on this campaign were in fact Ibrahim's, Ibrahim manages to pin responsibility for all the disasters on Iskender Çelebi. So gradually Iskender is sidelined, then he's divested of his functions, and then ultimately in Baghdad, after they've arrived in Baghdad and dusted themselves and taken stock of the disaster, Ibrahim is hanged in the horse market of Baghdad. And that night, the Sultan is sleeping, and Iskender appears, and he wraps his turban around the Sultan's neck, and he pulls, and the Sultan is woken up by the sound of his own screams. We have this from various Turkish chroniclers who were contemporaries or near contemporaries. So it is clearly a narrative that was disseminated by the Sultan himself. He had the dream, the nightmare, where Iskender came to him and he strangled him. Why did he strangle him? Because he had let Ibrahim turn the Sultan against him. He had let Ibrahim palm off responsibility for this disaster onto an innocent man. And at that moment, the Sultan takes a private vow that Ibrahim, his very close friend, his brother, probably his lover, all of those things rolled into one, has gone too far, and that he will not live out another year. And indeed, he doesn't live out another year. Because in Ramadan of 1536, Ibrahim is invited to the palace in Istanbul. He doesn't reappear. He is found dead, strangled by the deaf mutes of the palace, and his body is taken across the Golden Horn and buried in an unmarked grave. And there is no proclamation, there is no announcement. Ibrahim has disappeared. The message is clear. If, as Grand Vizier, you get too big for your boots, then this is how things will end up.
So now he's got rid of 3 of his main advisors, supporters. So is this all part of the thing you were talking about where they're just not replaced? He just takes the power for himself?
In the case of the Grand Vizier, that's a function that always needs to be filled. But after Ibrahim, it's not filled by the same man for such long periods, and there's a greater rotation of Grand Viziers. There are still powerful Grand Viziers, and the Sultan's own son-in-law becomes a Grand Vizier with comparable powers to Ibrahim. But the idea of the Sultan's absolute supremacy in matters of policy, the office of the Vizier remained, it had to be filled, but it was filled by people who did not exceed the boundaries of that office, and certainly not by people who thought that they actually could replicate or even exceed the powers of the Sultan.
Hi there, it's Peter here. UnseenHistories.com is now 3 months old, and already it is packed full of enticing, illuminating, and excellently presented historical material. If you give the site a visit today, you'll see many beautifully illustrated excerpts of books that we've featured on Travels Through Time. There's excerpts from Malcolm Gaskell's Ruin of All Witches, Nigel Pickford's Samuel Pepys and the Strange Wrecking of the Gloucester, and Gary Shaw's Egyptian mythology, along with many others as well. For those of you who like maps, you might want to check out the utterly compelling series of pieces on the Battle of Fredericksburg in 1862. That was a crucial moment in the American Civil War, along with a range of fabulously colorized images from Jordan Lloyd. It really is history for our times. UnseenHistories.com.
Okay, and can you take us, let's go to your third scene now. I believe a letter has arrived.
So this scene follows on rather from the last scene, because we're still in Baghdad. Suleyman is kind of recovering from this experience of having suffered a bit of a humiliation militarily, strategically, also having given the order for the execution of a man who he now thinks was probably innocent, having basically been taken for a ride. There's a lot of violence, there's a lot of kind of horror around the place, and then he gets a letter. And he gets a letter that takes him back into the life of the palace that he's left behind many, many months ago, and particularly back into the arms of his beloved. And his beloved is Hurrem, known in the West as Roxolana. Hurrem is another of these extraordinary characters who literally come from nowhere and end up one of the most powerful figures in contemporary politics. I'll talk about the letter that he's reading, which essentially is full of expressions of love and adoration. There are strong hints of humour. There are the kind of in-jokes that you would expect between a couple that has been together for so long and has had many children and has shared many vicissitudes. And it ends with this gloriously sort of over-the-top, but very playful sort of expression of love and devotion. As for this slave of yours who is burning in the fires of separation, whose liver is seared meat, whose chest is a battlefield, whose eyes are full of tears, who doesn't know day from light, who is drowning helplessly in an ocean of longing, who is afflicted by love for you worse than Farhad and Majnun, don't even ask about her. For each time I am separated from my sultan, I cry and sigh like a nightingale, and my condition is so pitiful that I wouldn't wish it on one of your infidel slaves. And this is the end of the letter, and after it I write, and I think this is true. A letter from Hurrem brings the well-being of opium, the hilarity of wine, the warmth of a brazier on a cold day, and it really is this lovely sense of the contrasting lives of a single person, that life of strategy and death and decisions that haunt you for the rest of your life, and then this wonderful lightness that comes from Hurrem. Now, Hurrem is one of the more remarkable figures of the 16th century. She was born in Ruthenia, what is now northern Ukraine. She was captured by slave traders, Tatar slave traders, who brought her to the Crimea, to the Crimean slave market. She was purchased there, put on a ship across the Black Sea. She ended up in the slave market in Istanbul, where she was purchased, very possibly by Ibrahim, for the royal harem. Now, not everyone who enters the royal harem gets very far. It's a very big establishment. It is regulated by very strict rules. It has an extremely strict hierarchy. And the Sultan already has consorts. He already has children from other women. There is no reason to suggest that Hurrem will be chosen in order to consort with the Sultan. She might end up, if she's very lucky, marrying a very rich pasha and living a life of opulence in another way, or she might end up in a range of other kind of eventualities of kind of differing degrees of luxury and comfort. But she has something special, and she is selected to pay the Sultan a nocturnal visit. So she's taken from the old palace, which is where the harem is, to the new palace, probably in a closed carriage or in a litter similarly closed, accompanied by eunuchs. And she's prepared so that she's she's wonderfully smelling, and she's dressed in seductive clothes. She's brought to the door of the privy chamber. That leads to more nights in the privy chamber, and it leads to a son, and that is usually game over for the imperial concubine or consort, because as soon as you have a male son, you are no longer welcome in the imperial bedchamber, and your job is to look after that male son and to raise him and to give him the best possible education in order that one day he will be a contender for the throne. And it's very clear that this will be a competitive tender, because there are all the other sons out there will also be going for the throne. Only one will get there and the others will inevitably die. So it's pregnant with threat and horror, and amid the joy of giving birth and of having a healthy male child by the Sultan. But Hurrem is a different kind of person. She doesn't accept that. And she has won a place in the Sultan's heart, and so she returns. And that is in itself exceptional. And she returns so much that the Sultan ends up trialing something quite revolutionary, which is called fidelity. And the other consorts are not happy about this. Now, quite early on, the mother of the firstborn male son of the Sultan, and we know this from a contemporary report, who is called Mahidevran, who is thought to be prettier than Hurrem, but Hurrem has a certain charm that she doesn't have. Anyway, Mahidevran was kind and welcoming to Hurrem when she arrived in the harem, but when she hears that Hurrem is going every night to the Sultan's bedchamber and that he never tires of her, Mahidevran doesn't like this. And so she gets together with Hurrem, and there's an altercation, and Mahidevran ends up pulling tufts of hair out of Hurrem's head and scratching and scoring her cheeks. And so next time the Sultan summons Hurrem to be by his side, she sends her regrets and she says, "I can't. I am sold meat." And that's what Mahidevran called her. She called her sold meat. "I'm sold meat, and my face is all scored, and I'm in no fit state to come into your auspicious presence." This only piques the Sultan's curiosity, which is clearly what Hurrem is trying to do. And so he insists that she come before him. She comes in this dishevelled, pitiful state, and he says what happened, and she tells him, and he sends her away. And then he calls Mahidevran. And Mahidevran is not a politician, she's not a diplomat in the way that Hurrem is. And she says, "Of course I did that to Hurrem, and she deserved it, and she deserved worse. And every other consort of the Sultan in the harem must consider me their superior." And the Sultan doesn't like this, and he never sees Mahidevran again. And it only makes Hurrem a stronger figure in the harem. And she ends up, after that campaign in Iran, marrying the Sultan and moving to the new palace. And that combination of marriage and living in the new palace with the Sultan is extremely innovative, extremely shocking. People don't like the influence that Hurrem has over the Sultan. They think that the Janissaries in particular, the kind of Praetorian Guard of the Ottoman Empire, mutter that she has bewitched the Sultan and that he has lost all reason because she has bewitched him. And in part 2 of this story that I will go on to tell, Hurrem becomes a very substantial figure in the political developments, and most notably in this question, the succession, because the succession, inevitably, as every reign progresses, the question of the succession becomes more and more important.
But it was obviously just a very romantic story, wasn't it? And they fell deeply in love with each other. And I imagine for him, especially once he'd lost these 3 important advisors, it must have been an extremely lonely existence, wasn't it? Having that amount of power and being able to have someone that you really trusted and that you loved to share it with was very important.
That sense of loneliness is something that you come across again and again in all systems of government where there's someone who's supposed to occupy some kind of pinnacle and be untouchable and unreachable. And certainly Suleiman felt that at the beginning of his reign, when he clung ever more closely to Ibrahim. And later on, he compensated for the loss of Ibrahim and the loneliness he felt in other ways by remaining extremely close to Hürrem.
And even just having someone to talk things through, shall I go and invade this place now, and that kind of thing.
I would imagine so. We obviously don't know, other than this a small number of letters that survive, precisely the nature of how they communicated to each other. But we can surmise, because her quarters in the new palace, which were incredibly lavishly decked out, and she had ladies of her own personal harem who were her attendants who were with her. Her facilities were second to none. This section of the palace was bang next door to the Sultan's. They were divided literally by one gate, so that they could actually go between the two, or she could go and visit him without anyone really knowing. And that inner part, or the furthest part of the palace from the entrance, is the most inaccessible part of the palace, and no official after Ibrahim was ever permitted to go in there, other than a small number who had kind of domestic functions, and a small number of eunuchs. And then it was a very private place.
So it was a sort of domestic sphere.
It was a domestic sphere, exactly.
And did that carry on, that tradition? Did his successors have wives like that, or did it go back to the sort of harem model?
There was a period later on which Ottoman historians describe as the beginning of the decline, and that was when the consorts of the sultans became more powerful than the sultans. And there were
that was part of the decline.
The Ottoman historian said that's the reason for the decline. And it is true that the whole notion of the Sultan being sent out, or the princes being sent out to learn their trade as provincial governors and then competing with each other, that was undermined, and increasingly sultans kept their sons very close to them and gave them a childhood that essentially consisted of a gilded imprisonment. And their mothers became more important and more powerful. And there was a kind of period where sultanic authority was kind of undermined, and even sultans themselves, I'm thinking more of the 17th century, very rarely emerged from the palace themselves. And so the functions of the empire were passed on to hereditary families of bureaucrats, and then there was this sometimes very powerful figure of the Queen Mother or the consort of the Sultan, who was also powerful. And so this also coincided with a kind of the rise of European power. And so the conclusion that these traditionalist historians drew was that this was because of the excessive power enjoyed by the women in the harem and the associated effeminacy of the sultans.
Right. Yeah, that sounds familiar. I think we've heard that before. So I think now we just have one more question that I need to ask you, which is if you could have picked something up from one of these moments or from this year and brought it back with you to the present, what would it be?
Well, I'm going to go for something that exists in this year, but it's slightly been put in a cupboard. It goes back just a few years earlier, its kind of disclosure. And the context for this is the coronation of Charles V, the Habsburg Holy Roman Emperor, Suleiman's great rival, in Bologna by the Pope. The dissemination through woodcuts and the printing press of images of these two parading around Bologna wearing their crowns. The papal three-tiered tiara, and then the mitre crown surmounted by a cross of the Holy Roman Emperor. And this was considered a great PR coup for Charles V. It showed his aspirations to a world empire, and the crown was seen as a kind of symbol of his power and dominion. And essentially what Ibrahim Pasha, who was the kind of choreographer of this part of Suleiman's reign, said, well, we've got to have one of those, and we've got to make it bigger and better. And he was very close to the Venetians. He'd been born a Venetian citizen, and Alvise Gritti had a finger in this particular pie as well. essentially what happened was a consortium of Venetian jewelers were commissioned to create a crown. And this crown, we have descriptions of it, very detailed descriptions. The diarist Marino Sanudo, Venetian diarist, visited it, saw it after it had just been finished. It was in Venice before it made it. It wended its rather serpentine way towards the Ottoman Empire, where the Sultan, who was in any case heading north for a campaign, took reception of it. It was valued at 144,000 ducats, and just to put that into context, Andrea Doria, the Genoese admiral, was at the same time building an entire new fleet that was the budget for which was 150,000 ducats. So an entire new fleet and one single crown cost basically the same. It was saturated in jewels and gems and incredible stones. It had 4 tiers rather than the papal 3. It was obviously never designed to be worn. No neck, let alone the Sultan's swan-like neck, could ever sustain it. So it was carried on a cushion. And it was unveiled during his progress north in 1532, and we have very good descriptions of it in Niš, which is a town in Serbia, and the townspeople gathered, and they watched the entire Ottoman army march past, and the climax to this was this beautiful page boy holding a cushion with this extraordinary object, which can only have looked like a kind of golden sugar cone embedded with assorted glazed fruit, until you look closer and you see, no, it's actually solid gold, and this is all gemstones.
And do we have any idea what happened to it?
There was a certain amount of embarrassment, I think, after that, because some of the doctors of the law said, well, listen, this is all very well, but it all sounds a bit Western and a bit Christian. And Iskender Çelebi, the treasurer was muttering about 144,000 ducats on a crown that could be spent on mounting a campaign or building a fleet. It didn't seem like money very well spent. And it was associated with Alvise Gritti, who then came to a sticky end. It was associated with Ibrahim Pasha, who then came to a sticky end. So after a few outings, it was actually put in a cupboard. And eventually it was dismantled. And I don't know of any certified component of that crown existing or known to exist today.
That's a cool thought, though, that maybe the crown jewels of current heads of state perhaps contain the odd diamond or
Precisely, no, because there was a lot of recycling, as you're hinting. So what I'd like, with your permission, is to take that crown, and I wouldn't wear it either. I'd probably just sell it and then enjoy the money.
Good. I like your honesty. I applaud your honesty there. You wouldn't want to have it, on your table. I wonder who would buy it. That would be interesting. Elon Musk or Jeff Bezos? I don't know. Thank you so much. It's been a really, really fascinating discussion today. And I urge people to buy The Lion House and find out more about Suleyman the Magnificent. And yes, I'm looking forward to the second instalment, whenever that's going to be forthcoming. Thank you, Christopher.
Brilliant. Thank you so much.
That was me, Violet Moller, talking to Christopher de Bellaigue the other day. His riveting book, The Lion House, The Coming of a King, has just been published. For more information and to see some splendid images, please visit our website, tttpodcast.com, where you can also subscribe to our newsletter. I hope you enjoyed today's episode. Until next time, goodbye.